After cities like Jerusalem and Bethlehem, Jericho may be the most familiar city mentioned in the Bible. Jericho was a main point of entry to the Holy Land from the east. It was the hub of a major agricultural area, and it was a thriving and prosperous commercial center. In the New Testament Gospels, now that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus met Zacchaeus in Jericho, and you may remember that it turned Zacchaeus' life around completely. Here's the ancient tree that locals say is the very one that Zacchaeus climbed to get a better view of the Lord. You may also remember that the Samaritan, we know him as the Good Samaritan, was on that road from Jerusalem to Jericho when he came upon the Jewish man who was beaten, robbed, and left for dead, and then he helped him to recovery. Back in the Old Testament book of Joshua, Jericho was the first city that Israel conquered as they entered the land of Canaan in Joshua 6. Remember, they walked around the walls of Jericho once a day for 6 days, and on the seventh they walked around 7 times, blowing their trumpets and shouting, and the walls came tumbling down. But did that really happen? Many people today would find the story to be pretty far-fetched. And I bring this up because Jericho serves as a prime example of how different people with different biases and points of view can look at the same information and come up with very different conclusions. Happens all the time in politics and family matters and so on. And we tend to get pretty frustrated with that phenomenon. I think what we're going to see at Jericho gives some real clues as to why this sort of thing happens. So as you'll see in the latter part of this video, there's a more recent city built next to the dirt mound that covers the ruins of ancient Jericho. And believe it or not, it was this more recent city that Jesus visited. It may be about 2,500 years old, as opposed to the ancient ruins, which could be as much as 5 or even 8,000 years old. Over the years, there have been several archaeological excavations at the mound, which we call Tel es-Sultan. But the vast majority of ancient Jericho is still untouched. 2 archaeologists in particular worked on ancient Jericho during the 20th century. First, John Garstang excavated in Jericho from 1930 to 1936. After a lot of work, Garstang concluded that the deeper layers of the mound, which he dated to around 1400 BC, dramatically confirmed the record of Joshua 6. He found, for instance, that the mud brick walls of the city at that level had fallen outward almost everywhere. The pottery he examined showed signs of sudden destruction and abandonment, and there were large stores of grain which were not salvaged or plundered, but were burned where they lay. Now in Joshua 6, remember, God forbade Israel from plundering Jericho and ordered that the entire city be burned and left untouched. So in his report, Garstang stated that he believed that his excavation largely supported the Bible's record. On the other hand, Kathleen Kenyon dug in another spot on the mound from 1952 to 1958. Her conclusions were quite the opposite. She believed that Garstang was almost completely mistaken about the date of the destruction of the city at that level. She said the destruction was probably much earlier and that it was due either to an earthquake or an Egyptian invasion, something like that. In her report, she wrote that nothing she found had any correspondence to the Joshua account, which she believed to be just an ancient Israelite fable. So which view is accurate? Well, I personally believe in the Bible, and I favor Garstang's findings. In 1 Kings 6, the Bible states that Israel came out of Egypt 480 years before Solomon took his throne around 960 BC. So Garstang's date in the late 1400s BC for the destroyed layers would be about right. The evidence closely matched the Joshua record. Makes sense. The argument that Kenyon made that the miraculous collapse of the walls is just an ancient fable, I think is a lot like many other examples of the skeptical view that the ancient Israelites were ignorant, backward, prone to making up amazing stories about themselves, and so on. And like all of us, I think Kathleen Kenyon was a product of her own experiences, biases, prejudices, and the training that happened to be in vogue at the time they were in school. So what does this example from ancient Jericho have to do with us today? Well, just this. Ultimately, our deepest beliefs determine what we see and how we interpret what we see. You tend to interpret the evidence before you in light of how it fits with your basic view of the world. So if you think the Israelites were liars and the writers of the Bible were backward, then any evidence to the contrary probably is not going to change your mind. You'll find other ways to fit the evidence into your worldview. But if you think God had something to do with the writing of the Bible, and that the miracles that are shown there may occur at times for specific reasons, then evidence that supports that view tends to make sense. After all, didn't Jesus say in Matthew 13:15, "For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears. They have closed their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them." With that in mind, here's what Melinda and I experienced in Jericho in January of 2015. Here we go. Come along for the ride.
City of Jericho. We are at the old portion.
This is es-Sultan, which is the mound or the hillside that covers the ancient city of Jericho, the city that Joshua would have walked around, the city that Zacchaeus would have lived in, and other places. Perhaps in the background, I don't know if you can hear this, but the Muslim call to prayer is happening right now, the mid-afternoon call to prayer. And it's in the mosque off to my right-hand side, where you can see the picture, the call of prayer coming from that direction. Behind me, you'll see some ancient ruins. I'm not exactly sure what period those ruins date from. I don't think they're terribly early. They're probably something from maybe the Ottoman period or something like that. We'll pan around just so that you can see there's really not much excavation that's gone on here. Just a little bit from time to time, back in the 20s and then again in the 40s and 50s, but a lot more still to be excavated here at Jericho, in this very Muslim place in the middle of Israel. This is a place controlled by the Palestinian Authority. We had to have our passes, or our bus driver's pass, checked when we came in. So this is a very different, very Muslim, very Arab place right here, and of course a very historic place. They say that Jericho is the oldest city, the oldest continuously inhabited city in the entire world.